It began, like most tragedies do, in a place that seemed safe. Glenwood University was known for its serenity, its scholarship, its sense of order. Professors wore tweed blazers. Students quoted philosophers between classes. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. Until it did. On a cold March morning in 2011, the door to Professor Thomas Baldwin's office was forced open by a janitor, who hadn't seen the professor in over 48 hours. What he found inside was something no student, no colleague, no university president could have prepared for. Baldwin, a beloved psychology lecturer, father, and mentor, was dead, slumped in his office chair, a deep wound to the neck, blood pooled beneath his desk. No signs of forced entry, no missing items, just silence. Within hours, the university was in lockdown. By noon, the media had arrived. By sunset, rumors were already spreading. And when the name Emmanuela Evans was whispered for the first time, everything changed. She was a student, a psychology major, quiet, smart, and transgender. But what the headlines didn't say, at least not at first, was that Emmanuela and Professor Baldwin were more than just mentor and mentee. They were lovers. Or at least, that's what Baldwin let her believe. What started as comfort turned into control. What felt like love became a leash. And when Baldwin tried to cut her loose, he forgot something crucial. You can't shatter someone who's already in pieces and expect them not to bleed. This is the story of a woman who wanted to be seen, and a man who used her need for acceptance, until it ended with blood on his hands, or hers. And by the end of this video, you'll be asking the same question the jury did. Was it murder, or was it survival? Stay with us, because this story doesn't begin with death. It begins with identity. Before the headlines, before the trial, before the blood on the floor of Baldwin's office, there was a child named Emmanuel, born in 1989 in a small town in Mississippi where church bells rang louder than truth. Emmanuel grew up in a world that had no space for who he truly was. To everyone else, he was just another boy, polite, quiet, God-fearing, but inside, he was drowning. By age 13, Emmanuel already knew something was wrong. He didn't have the words for it yet. All he knew was that when he looked in the mirror, the reflection wasn't his. When people said he, it felt like a bruise. And when he was told to man up, it was like being handed a mask soaked in acid. His parents, deeply religious, didn't notice his quiet suffering. Or maybe they did, and chose not to see it. They praised his good grades, scolded him for slouching, and reminded him to pray harder whenever he looked lost. But prayer didn't help. And home stopped feeling like home. In school, Emmanuel excelled, not because he was happy, but because studying was the only place he could disappear. Each A was a shield. Each award was a distraction. He wasn't chasing success. He was outrunning pain. In 2007, he applied to Glenwood University, not because he dreamed of going there, but because it was far enough away from Mississippi to breathe. And when he stepped onto campus for the first time, he exhaled like someone who had been holding his breath for 18 years. This was where Emmanuel became Emmanuela. But transitions don't begin with hormones or surgery. They begin with hope. And hope, for someone like her, was more dangerous than anything she'd ever known. Because now, she had something to lose. The first time Emmanuel whispered the name Emmanuela, it wasn't out loud. It was scribbled, trembling, in the margin of a psychology textbook, half prayer, half dare. Because giving herself a name wasn't just symbolic, it was defiant. It said, I exist, and I choose to be seen. But choosing to be seen came at a cost. In the fall of 2010, at age 21, Emmanuel began her transition. She started hormone therapy quietly, avoiding eye contact at the clinic. Each injection was both salvation and sabotage. Salvation, because she finally began to feel like herself. Sabotage, because the more she became Emmanuela on the outside, the more the world began to turn against her. Her family was the first to go. Her mother called her once after the news. Just once. The conversation lasted 5 minutes. It ended with scripture and silence. Her father never called at all. She wrote him 3 letters. One was torn up before she mailed it. The second was never opened. The third came back marked, "Return to sender." That phrase haunted her. Return to sender. As if she was a mistake mailed to the wrong body. As the weeks passed, the loneliness grew louder. Dorm room dinners, silent hallways, stares in the cafeteria that felt like knives. Even on a liberal campus, tolerance was paper-thin. Whispers followed her. Pronouns were weaponized. Some professors offered kindness, but only from a distance. Others just pretended she wasn't there. So she buried herself in books, majored in psychology. Because if she couldn't find acceptance out there, maybe she could find understanding in here, in the mind. And that's when she met him. Professor Thomas Baldwin. Respected, charismatic, brilliant. A man who looked her in the eye and didn't flinch. Who said her name, Emmanuela, like it meant something. In a world that still refused to call her by who she truly was. He did. And that was all it took. To most people at Glenwood University, Professor Thomas Baldwin was a man who had it all. Late 40s, silver at the temples. A voice like velvet over gravel. Smooth, steady, comforting. He could stand in front of a lecture hall and silence a room with a single glance. Not out of fear, but fascination. He taught psychology like it was poetry. Quoted Carl Jung 1 minute and cracked a joke the next. Students adored him. Faculty respected him. And behind that warm intellectual charm was a man who always kept people guessing. But Emmanuela? She didn't see him as a mystery. She saw him as safety. When she first walked into his class in fall 2010, Baldwin didn't look at her like the others did. There was no double take, no hesitation, no polite masking of discomfort. He just nodded, professor to student, and asked her opinion on Freud's concept of the divided self. And in that moment, she wasn't a trans student. She was just a student. It was the first time she felt real. After class, he lingered, asked if she was okay. Not in a patronizing way, but with genuine interest. Soon, she was staying after every lecture, talking about textbooks, then about trauma, then about herself. He listened, patiently, intently, told her she was brave, told her she was becoming who she was meant to be, and she believed him. Because when the world turns its back on you, the first person who offers warmth doesn't just feel kind, they feel like oxygen. But what Emmanuela didn't know, what she couldn't yet see, was that Baldwin didn't just listen out of empathy. He listened because he knew what she needed. He saw her vulnerability, her hunger for acceptance. And to a man like Baldwin, that wasn't beauty. That was opportunity. It began with a touch on the shoulder, a compliment that lingered too long, an email that blurred the line between academic and personal. By January 2011, Emmanuela and Baldwin were no longer just professor and student. They were something else, something unspoken, but unmistakable. He never said, "I love you." not directly. But he called her special, said she was the only one who truly understood him. He'd lean in during late-night study sessions and whisper that he admired her courage, that no one had ever made him feel this way, that she was the first person he'd ever trusted with his full self. And for a woman like Emmanuela, who had been rejected by her family, ignored by her peers, and stared at like a spectacle, those words felt like rescue. But there was a catch, always a catch. Baldwin insisted on secrecy. No holding hands in public, no texts during daylight, no photos, no proof. "It's not the right time," he said. "People won't understand," he said. "The university wouldn't approve," he warned. What he meant was, "My career is more important than your visibility." But Emmanuela, aching for love, accepted the conditions. Because when you've spent your whole life hiding, one more secret doesn't seem like a sacrifice. It feels like survival. And at first, she believed him. Believed that love meant discretion. That shame was just the price of intimacy. That maybe, just maybe, this was as close to happiness as she'd ever get. But slowly, the walls began to close in. His affection came in waves, intense, then cold. His control was subtle. Who she could talk to, what she could wear, when she could come to his office. And every time she questioned it, he made her feel like the problem. "Do you know how lucky you are that I see you?" he'd say. Gaslighting, wrapped in praise, manipulation, dressed as mentorship. By March, the affair wasn't love anymore. It was a leash. And Baldwin? He was the one holding it. March 5th, 2011. The air on campus still carried the last chill of winter. But inside Baldwin's office, the temperature had dropped to something colder than weather. Emmanuela sat across from him, her back straight, her voice shaking. This wasn't tutoring. This was something else. She had come here to ask the question she had been swallowing for weeks. When are we going to stop hiding? Baldwin looked up from his desk, the usual warmth gone. His eyes, once so reassuring, were now clinical, cold, detached. "You know it's complicated," he said. "I have a wife, a reputation. This isn't some fairy tale." The words landed like bricks, not because she hadn't heard them before, but because this time he meant them. She had imagined this conversation 100 times. In some versions, he chose her. In others, he cried. But in reality, he barely looked at her. She reminded him that he once called her brave, that he said he needed her, that he understood what it meant to feel invisible. But now, he made her feel smaller than ever. "We were a moment," he said quietly. "Now, it's time to move on." Move on? To where? Her family was gone. Her community saw her as a curiosity at best. And the only man who had ever made her feel loved just erased her. She left his office, numb, walked across campus in silence. Students passed her by, laughing, talking, living in a world she had never been invited into. Back in her dorm room, she stared at the wall for hours. Her phone lit up with no messages. Her inbox stayed empty. Her hands trembled, not with rage, but with realization. She had given her heart to a man who only wanted her as long as she stayed hidden. And now, she was alone again. But this time, something inside her snapped. Not with anger, with clarity. She had been used, and discarded, and erased. And the only thing worse than being hated was being nothing. March 8th, 2011. The sun rose like any other Tuesday at Glenwood University. Birds chirped outside the psychology building. Students sipped coffee on their way to class. And behind a locked office door, Professor Thomas Baldwin lay slumped in his chair, throat slit, blood soaking through his dress shirt, eyes still open, staring at nothing. When the janitor found him at 7:43 a.m., the room was oddly still. No sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle. Just one man, one wound, and one secret. Finally exposed. News of the murder spread like fire. By noon, the entire campus was in lockdown. By nightfall, the media had the story. But what they didn't have, not yet, was a suspect. That changed quickly, because Baldwin had been seen with one student more than any other. He had mentored her, praised her, invited her into his office after hours, and she had been the last known person to see him alive. Emmanuela Evans. She didn't run. She didn't hide. When detectives knocked on her dorm door, she opened it calmly. They asked if she had seen Baldwin. She nodded. "I was there Monday night," she said. "He was fine when I left." But there was something in her eyes. Not fear, not defiance, just exhaustion, like someone who had finally stopped pretending. The questions kept coming. Where were you after? Why didn't you mention the visit earlier? What was the real nature of your relationship? And she gave them only part of the truth. She admitted he was her professor, that he had helped her through hard times, that they had grown close, but she didn't say the word affair. Not yet. Not when she knew what the world would do with that word. Not when she was still trying to figure out whether what they had was love or something far more manipulative. What she didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that Baldwin's computer held emails, his trash bin held torn-up notes, and the murder weapon? A letter opener, from his own desk. No fingerprints, but Emmanuela's DNA was on the doorknob. And that would be enough to unravel everything, because when a professor dies, and the student he hid dies inside, someone always pays. By March 10th, 2011, the murder of Professor Thomas Baldwin had left the halls of Glenwood University and entered every living room in the state. Local reporters swarmed the campus. Cameras captured candlelight vigils. News anchors spoke of a respected professor slain in cold blood. And when the police released the name of the prime suspect, the tone shifted from tragedy to spectacle. Emmanuela Evans, transgender, student, murderer? The media didn't just report the case, they fed on it. Headlines screamed, "Trans student linked to campus slaying." Secret affair turns deadly. He mentored her, she killed him. But none of them asked why Baldwin had hidden the relationship. None of them questioned the power dynamic. None of them mentioned the isolation, the manipulation, the control. They just saw a trans woman and turned her into a headline. Within 24 hours, Emmanuela's dorm room door was vandalized. Slurs scrawled in red marker. Threats slid under the door in torn notebook paper. Online forums lit up with hate, calling her a freak, a predator, a disgrace. The university tried to issue a neutral statement. They called the situation under investigation. But behind closed doors, professors whispered. Students avoided her. The one place that once felt like her sanctuary had become a prison. And no one came to her defense. Her old friends? Silent. Her family? Still absent. And the man who once called her brave, lying cold in a casket, leaving her to carry the weight of both their secrets. She was no longer Emmanuela, the student. She was the other woman, the scandal, the face of every fear people project onto what they don't understand. And as her name echoed through news cycles, she sat in her room, shades drawn, watching a world that never accepted her now punish her for simply existing. This wasn't justice. This was public execution, by rumor, by bias, by fear. She hadn't been convicted in court yet, but she'd already been sentenced, in the eyes of everyone else. May 15th, 2012. A year after Baldwin's death, the courtroom was packed, not just with reporters, not just with students and faculty, but with strangers, there to watch what they thought would be a spectacle. What they got was a slow, brutal dissection of a life, but not Baldwin's, Emmanuela's. From the very first day, it was clear. This wasn't just about whether she killed him. It was about who she was. The prosecution stood with confidence. They painted her as unstable, obsessive, a student who couldn't handle rejection. They read text messages aloud, messages of longing, frustration, heartbreak. They displayed photographs of Emmanuela before and after transition, as if to remind the jury, this is someone who changed everything about herself. What else might she be capable of changing? They held up the murder weapon, a letter opener, cleaned but not well enough. Emmanuela's DNA on the doorknob. Motive: a relationship turned sour. Opportunity: last one seen with him. Means: Baldwin's own office. The case, they claimed, was airtight, but the defense stood just as firmly. They didn't deny the relationship. They didn't deny the pain, but they did something the prosecution never attempted. They told her story. They spoke of a child growing up in the wrong skin, of rejection, abandonment, and isolation, of a professor who said all the right things until he had what he wanted, then left her to rot in his shadow. They didn't claim Emmanuela was perfect, but they asked a question that sat heavy in the room. If Baldwin had preyed on a cisgender female student the same way, would this court still be trying to vilify her? Or would we be calling her a victim? The jury sat silent. The media did not. Headlines said, "Trans killer on trial." He loved her in secret. She killed in rage. But in that courtroom, the truth was murkier. Because whether Emmanuela killed Baldwin or not, the trial was no longer about blood. It was about identity, about how society punishes people not for what they do, but for who they dare to become. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, some shouting for justice, others for vengeance. Inside, the air was thick, not just with tension, but with something colder. Judgment, not just of a crime, but of a person. When Emmanuela stood to hear the verdict, her hands didn't shake, her eyes didn't blink. She had spent her whole life waiting to be seen. And now, for better or worse, they were finally looking. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to send headlines. Baldwin's family wept. Some jurors refused to meet Emmanuela's gaze. And she just nodded. The sentence, 25 years to life. There was no celebration, no closure, only silence. Because no matter how the trial ended, no one won. Baldwin was dead. His family shattered by betrayal and scandal, his legacy forever stained by a secret he never had the courage to face in public. Emmanuela, once a student with hope in her eyes, was now inmate number 311490, a woman who had clawed her way into the light, only to be dragged back into society's darkest corners. But the biggest tragedy wasn't in the verdict. It was in the question no one wanted to ask. What if we had loved her instead of judged her? What if Baldwin had seen her as a person, not a secret? What if the world hadn't taught her that being different means being alone? This wasn't just a story about murder. It was a story about what silence costs, what happens when we punish honesty and reward deception, when we shame identity and protect the people who prey on those searching for acceptance. Baldwin died from a wound to the neck. But Emmanuela? She died long before that night. Every time someone refused to say her name, every time love came with conditions, every time the world told her she'd never belong. And now, the story is over. But the question still lingers. Did she kill out of rage or out of survival?